have a slide for you. I only have this single image with a quote from Faust that I became very obsessed with while working on this project. I actually put it on the title page of the paper itself. And I hope maybe as I finish it, you'll kind of understand how to relate this quote to what I'm talking about today. So I want to begin by talking about a very famous scene from Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, where this pre-human primate throws a bone up in the air, and there's this bizarre match cut to a large space satellite millions of years later. I have always loved this scene, and I've been fascinated by it because it seems to me to be a sort of riddle of sorts. I can sort of hear Kubrick asking me, can you tell me why I did this? So that's where I'm sort of going to sort of start today, because the match cut ultimately implies that the two objects have something in common, a sort of parallel that we can draw them both and sort of understand them both as. But also, what's so interesting about it is his juxtaposition of an object from the dawn of human existence with a humanity that is in this later advanced technological society implies that what he gleans from these two images is something that he gleans from humanity that has been with us from the very beginning, our now and then, our past and future. So let's explore the context of that scene very briefly. So these two bands of primates are battling over control of this water hole. And one of the groups is a primate who picks up a bone from the ground and wields it as a weapon for the very first time. This obviously gives his group an advantage and allows them to take control of the water hole. We can look at what this bone represents in a few different ways, especially when we simultaneously think of the satellite. The satellite isn't really established to be a weapon, so we can immediately remove that possibility at least. We can possibly view them both as symbols of humans attaining power in the world. But this understanding comes with the assumption that the satellite is meant to be a demonstration of power. I'm not very comfortable doing that either. You could say that it's maybe humans having power over nature, but again, I want to get at something a bit more simplistic here. Let's make a very safe and agreeable observation. Both of these objects are tools. They are both devices used as a means to accomplish something else. We might even say that the bone is a sort of primitive technology, but they are both, above all, vehicles. We are obviously not using the term vehicle to refer to an automobile or any motorized vehicle like a train. We're using the vehicle which defines it as a means, that thing which carries our noun towards its desired objective. We might say, for example, that a filmmaker is using their film as a vehicle for social satire. Vehicles are used when something is too troublesome to act upon merely using our own bodies, or the previously established means. Walking several miles every time we want to go somewhere is burdensome, so we created transport vehicles. Lifting tables or large furniture is burdensome, so we created the dolly. Killing someone with our bare hands is far too dangerous and burdensome, so we created the firearm, knives, and other vehicles. In the case of our bone, we can certainly attempt to make a judgment as to what the tool is representative of. As previously considered, we can see that the bone is a display of power and used for intimidation. However, the bone is immediately used as a vehicle for murder in this scene. The bone, much like any other tool wielded by a human, acts as a sort of electric conductor for human will. This is the nature of all vehicles. The vehicle acts as an in-between for the human will and the thing which the human will wishes to act upon. We notice throughout this process of creating vehicles that part of their inherent function is a sort of disconnection. It removes that necessary human performance that can be burdensome, dangerous, or inefficient. It is not the human that kills someone, it is the firearm. The prominence of vehicles in human existence has ultimately led to a crisis of accountability. Particularly in technology, the tasks involved are broken apart and dispersed in such great detail and minutia that we cannot possibly understand who to blame when things go awry. As an example, imagine an assembly line to create a simple piece of machinery. This machine is assembled piece by piece on a conveyor belt manned by multiple people. As it travels along the conveyor belt, it makes multiple stops where one person adds a single piece. These individuals add one piece each until the conveyor belt reaches the end and the contraption is fully complete. We might think it would be easy to identify where the problem lies if something went wrong with the machine. But in our example, I've failed to mention until now that the pieces that these individuals are using to make the machinery also need to be assembled. Furthermore, the pieces which need to be assembled in order to assemble those pieces also need to be assembled. This process continues nearly ad infinitum. It's here that we witness the horror of an object like the satellite, which makes the simple nature of a tool like the bone pale in comparison. The satellite represents a freak amalgamation of vehicles. Consider the development of artificial intelligence and the popularity of ChatGPT, which is considered a black box AI. These artificial intelligence programs are developed by feeding information into them, but their internal workings are a mystery to its users. Users can see the system's inputs and outputs, but they can't see what happens within the AI tool to produce those outputs. The French philosopher Jacques Ellul once gave the example of a dam that breaks. Who is responsible for that, he asked. When geologists worked on it to examine the terrain, engineers drew up the construction plans, workmen constructed it, and politicians decided that the dam had to be in that spot. No one is responsible, he says. You might also experience a mundane version of this while shopping at a large grocery store. You want to return an item, but the cashier and store manager might immediately be averse to doing so because of quote-unquote store policy. You reach out to the corporate department, and suddenly your refund is honored with an apology for what happened at the store, implying that this was not how the corporate department believed this should have been handled. The cashier and store manager cannot be held responsible because they were just following the corporate rules. Yet at the same time, the company handwaves the occurrence as not being quote-unquote in line with their values or something along those lines. We witness here what happens when we create vehicles for our vehicles, when bureaucracies have a power structure which seems to move sideways rather than strictly top to bottom. It makes a trip to the grocery store feel like a trip to Kafka's castle. The role and decisions of the manager are repeatedly obscured and undercut by the choices of those sideways to them as well as under them, administrators, assistants, and the like. We might refer to vehicles for vehicles, quote unquote, as being a system. Within systems, we see that humans themselves become vehicles for other humans. They evade responsibility using the same process by which someone pays a hitman to do their dirty work. Masaharu Homa, the man who commanded the Japanese 14th Army in the occupation of the Philippines during World War II, used this exact excuse when horrific war crimes committed by his unit to captured prisoners of war came to light and he was subsequently put on trial. He expressed genuine shock at learning about the atrocities and was sentenced to death for his negligence in commanding his men. There's always an implicit deal being made which we can identify here. When the human will enters the conductor that is the vehicle, the human loses control over that will. When someone uses a lawnmower to cut their grass, the lawnmower is the one accomplishing the task at hand. Therefore, if the lawnmower stopped working, the task would no longer be able to be done. Indeed, all of technological development can be interpreted as the human will being lost in the machines. We have forgotten how to live without them. Progression leads to regression. Technological efficiency also becomes an oppressive rule for others and ourselves, much in the same sense that Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno once critiqued Enlightenment values by stating that, quote, within its logic, anything which does not conform to the standard of calculability and utility must be viewed with suspicion. It is becoming increasingly difficult to exist without our vehicles, and popular culture, as well as even our own friends and family, will cast us aside as being ridiculous relics of the past when we are not able to constantly be reached via cell phone, unable to resolve a customer service issue by going onto a website or walking instead of using a car. This is the vehicle culture, which emphasizes absolute ease, thus leading to absolute disconnection. We leave our fates in invisible hands, whether it be a rogue artificial intelligence, the immensely complex systems and industries which contribute to climate change, or the atomic bomb, which will likely not be triggered by a world leader, but by an untraceable military engineer. our demise will be none of our business. It is through the never-ending pursuit of ease that we will cease to have control of anything. It is now more than ever that we need to be like Kierkegaard and make difficulties everywhere. Put another way, it is now more than ever that we need philosophy and philosophers alike. Philosophy dwells in difficulty. What was Socrates put to death for, if not because his persistent questions disrupted the ease with which Athenians carried on with their lives and preconceptions? As human action continuously becomes filtered by way of technological vehicles, one cannot ignore how much human thought is becoming filtered as well, via propagandizing mass media. The act of thinking and fundamental problem solving is also becoming increasingly called into question as students become dependent on ChatGPT for research or essay assignments. Technological pessimism is not the purpose of this writing. Instead, the purpose is to encourage, whenever applicable, engagement with the world and your own thoughts directly. Cling to what you can still control. Be responsible in a causal sense, not necessarily in the sense of a kind of moral duty. I would like to conclude my presentation with a quote taken from an interview with Michel Foucault. If you know anything about Foucault's work, you might think of his worldview as being quite cynical and twisted. I know what little I've read of Foucault. Every time I finish a page, I think, wow, that's a bummer. But he has this quote in this interview that I love, and I think it deeply informs my worldview and why I feel passionately about my subject. Foucault, in this interview, said, "My point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous, which is not exactly the same as bad. If everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do. So my position leads not to apathy, but to a hyper and pessimistic activism." Thank you. Carson.
Eric, this is great. I love the technology paper. So you said the human will lost in the machine. And so I'm wondering, other than stepping away from devices and machines, is there a way that we can reinsert human will or intention back into machines?
Yeah. So for me, the first thing that pops into my head is the example of the lawnmower, for example, because I imagine if everyone in this room had the task of mowing their lawn and their lawnmower stopped working, they would put their hands up and go, oh, I can't mow my lawn anymore. When realistically and historically, there were plenty of ways to cut one's grass without this device. And I think ultimately, the solution to me, not the solution, I think that any solution that I come up with would probably just deepen the problem. But what I'll say is, and I hate to give this sort of cop-out answer, but I do sort of stand by what I said at the very end, where I think that there's a very strict wisdom in just simply being aware when you are becoming over-reliant on something. A really good example, as someone who works at the Writing Center at the Armstrong campus, I'm horrified.
Sorry.
I'm horrified at the amount of students who are using ChatGPT to help write their papers.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what I often tell them is, and this is what I find as well when I am helping them, trying to push them to actually do it themselves, is they know how to do it themselves. You just have to push them hard enough. They become so fixated on this idea of ease that they genuinely forget what they can and cannot do. So I would answer your question by saying sort of what I was saying at the very end, that we need to cling to what we know we can do and realize that we're capable of doing more than we seem to think that we are.
Thank you.
Sam, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I love Kafka, so I'm glad you brought him up. But to ask, I guess, phrase in terms of Kafka is, in the trial, of course, Joseph K. dies with, quote, shame, right? He died like a dog. And so, is it because he's too obsessed with like a sort of vehicle of getting freedom rather than just living his life, like if he was free? Was it this obsession that he had to prove or find a way out of his guilt that caused him to die with shame? And that really, if he was truly believed he was free, he should have just lived his life as if he was.
I I hate to tell you this, man, I have not read the trial. Yes.
Well, I think you had an awesome paper. I put down a couple like quotes from you, but I really like the we're leaving our fates in invisible hands. I think that's a really cool line. I know you kind of touched on it in an earlier answer to a question. You mentioned in your paper, I think you say technological regression. Would you say rather than truly regress and be like, all right, we're taking everyone's dishwashers, no
Right.
one's having these things anymore.
The pure fear.
Are you truly just saying it's something you need to be aware of? No, you can hand wash your dishes if you need to.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I just have hand washed my dishes before, right? But yeah, so when I want to particularly clarify, I believe at least the only time that I talked about regression in this paper, I'm not so much talking about technological regression, but the regression of humans. Essentially, as we become infantilized almost by the fact that we sort of forget to do these fundamental things because we're so used to these machines helping us do them more efficiently. As far as that, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not a lawyer, but and I definitely do not think that in my lifetime, at least, unless there's a true nuclear winter and we just go back to square one, I don't think that we're ever going to be less technologically advanced than we are now. So again, I hate to be blunt, and I hate to be sort of a cop-out, but I don't advocate for any policy change regarding technology. I advocate for personal change with one's relationship to technology, one that is simply more self-aware.
Yes.
This will be the last question, right?
Okay, so my question is a little bit about the Foucauldian component on the Foucault's concept of power knowledge. That there are these regimes and technologies by which thought becomes possible. And I think the question I want to relate that to is whether or not, because this is why Foucault would be suspicious of a lot of different ways in which we think we freed our thought from these regimes.
Right.
At what point could we understand ourselves to have freed the human will from this regime? Because it would seem that at the point where we believe that we freed the will, we've really just accepted a new frame and a new epistemology.
Yeah, I love that you asked this question because it reminds me a lot of a philosopher that I like, and Armstrong. It's probably heard me name drop him 30 million times. His name is Byung-Chul Han. He's sort of responding to and answering Foucault a lot in his writing. And what Han, just to sort of briefly just to summarize what Han's sort of critique of Foucault, well, not necessarily a critique per se, but his sort of response to Foucault's, Han sees this insane access to choice, this insane access to freedom, which we seem to have now more than ever. And Han is very suspicious of that because this idea essentially is the more knowledge that we seem to grasp, or put in an even more twisted way, the more knowledge that the people above us pretend to give us, the more freedom that they pretend to give us, the more freedom that we have to actually pimp ourselves, abuse ourselves, and subjugate ourselves. Han particularly is very interested in this idea of self-optimization culture or self-improvement culture, when really all you're doing is just making yourself a better worker for your boss. That's literally all you're doing. So this notion that knowledge is power, on some basic premise level, I agree with it, but with knowledge and with power comes you also learning more ways to subjugate yourself. So, yeah.
Okay.